Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Vladimir Alexandrov, the B.E. Bensinger Professor of Slavic Languages and Literatures at Yale University. He is an expert on 19th and 20th century Russian prose, especially the works of Leo Tolstoy, Andrei Bely, and Vladimir Nabokov, and on literary theory. Professor Alexandrov is the author of a number of scholarly books and publications and has received several notable awards. Today we talk with Professor Alexandrov about his new book, The Black Russian, which recently won the Macmillan Center's Gustav Ranis International Book Prize. Welcome, Professor Alexandrov.
Thank you very much.
Let's begin with an overview of your book. Tell us about it.
It's a biography of an absolutely remarkable man. He was the son of former slaves in Mississippi who became a multimillionaire entrepreneur in Tsarist Moscow, lost everything in the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, and reestablished himself in Constantinople as the Sultan of Jazz.
Wow, and this is quite a departure for you from the other books you have written. What led you to write it?
It was an accident that changed my life, and I remember the moment very clearly because I was preparing to teach a graduate seminar on Russian émigré culture between the wars. And I was reading the memoirs of a Russian singer who was very popular in the late 19-teens and 1920s, who described how when he escaped from the south of Russia, he wound up in Constantinople and began to perform, and I'll translate what he said in Russian into English, for our famous Moscow Negro Fyodor Fyodorovich Thomas. This was so unexpected that I remember literally closing the book and putting it down because for various historical reasons there were very few black people in Imperial Russia, whether from Africa, the Caribbean, or the United States. I knew the period, I knew something about the culture, and I was so intrigued that I decided to study it. And this led me to do work in archives and libraries in 6 countries, and was quite a trip.
I bet. So how did he get to Russia from Mississippi?
He broke the mold for people of his background at every step of his life. When his family fell apart in Memphis in 1890, when his father was brutally murdered, he went north, which was long before the large migration of black people from the south to the northern part of the United States. In 1894, he did something else that was very much ahead of the curve for black Americans seeking greater freedom. He went to Europe, and he picked up languages very easily, apparently enjoyed working as a waiter and a valet, which was a very portable skill, until in 1898 he came across a rich Russian in Monte Carlo who offered him a job as a valet in St. Petersburg. And that's how Thomas, his name was Frederick Bruce Thomas, came to Russia initially. And after that, his personal life and his career just skyrocketed.
So, you know, how did he become to be so famous? I mean, he sounds like a fascinating man.
He was. I think what he did is, first of all, he was a very bright man and very good at dealing with people. He was a wonderful psychologist. And he sort of brought the quintessence of Southern hospitality to Russia and amplified it. He ran popular entertainment venues, popular gardens that would have all kinds of theaters and entertainments in them, theaters themselves, restaurants. He was a great host, great attention to detail, and he was able to make a success of a business that was a very difficult business to be in those days, with a lot of competition.
And was this in Russia he was doing?
Yeah, he started out as a waiter in Russia around 1900. By 1911, he started to take off on his own with some Russian partners. Within a year of his opening his first business, he'd made, in today's dollars, over $1 million in clear profit, which he plowed into other investments, which were also extremely successful. So for popular entertainment, light operas, musical performances, light plays, farces, and so on, good food, lots of champagne, vaudeville performances of different kinds. He was one of the leading figures in Imperial Russia just before it all came crashing down in 1917.
So was he an entertainer himself, or just a kind of a man behind the scenes?
He had actually studied singing, and his family members, his sons in particular, always sang later on, but he was an entrepreneur, so he wasn't the actual draw on stage, but the one who organized it all. And he had a great talent for importing to Moscow successful acts from all over Europe, and even from the United States.
Right. So I'm curious, how did you manage to find out the details of his life?
I was lucky that he left a paper trail, because you can frequently come across interesting people who, for various reasons, didn't leave traces after them. But Frederick Thomas did, because he was successful in Moscow. And when he got to Constantinople, which is what Istanbul used to be called, as you know, he had a lot of dealings with the American consulate general in that city. And it was my wonderful fortune that the secretaries in that consulate general kept every last scrap of paper pertaining to Frederick Thomas's affairs that were delivered to their offices or that he sent to them. And they're all in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., so I was able to find a great deal of information. But it was fortunate that he left a paper trail.
Sure.
Yeah.
I am curious, in writing a biography and doing the research and piecing together someone's life, do you ever worry about getting something wrong?
Oh, all the time.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And the only thing one can do is to be as diligent as possible, to throw your net as widely as possible, to try to cross-reference details. One of the things that was a great challenge, but also a very appealing part of writing this up, was to be truthful to the facts as I knew them without modifying or exaggerating anything. And so if I was unsure about something that somebody said about him, I tried to hedge it in the way that I expressed it, without constantly saying, it seems that, or one could suppose something else. So it's cross-referencing things and being very wary as you walk the thin edge between invention and fact.
So were there people in his life at the time that you could also research to get information about him?
There were, and actually one of the most interesting people that he was friends with was a very famous black American boxer, Jack Johnson, who had become the world heavyweight champion in 1910 in the United States, had had a terrible time because of the racial barriers in the professional boxing world. The white champions wouldn't want to meet him in the ring. But when he did fight them, he won. And he was constantly hounded in the United States during the early 19-teens. And Frederick reached out to him from Moscow. When Jack Johnson was being run out of Chicago, Frederick offered him a gig in Moscow to put on exhibition matches, which Johnson accepted, except that he didn't get to Russia until 1914, right on the eve of the Great War. So they were able to become friends, but none of the matches that were planned, which would have been a major event in both entertainment and sport in Russia and in Europe, never took place. But yes, Jack Johnson is very well documented. He's a very well-known figure. So I was able to find people like that, and lesser ones too.
Now, for having been so infamous, I'll say, during his life, he's relatively unknown now. Whereas other people, like the boxer, for instance, have stood the test of time, so to speak. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, Frederick Thomas was pretty much forgotten when he died in 1928, and my book is the only study of him that exists. It's an attempt to bring him back to public memory. I think there are several reasons. One is American racism. We're talking about a period in American history when the achievements of black people were not actively celebrated by the white press and other media of the time. Also, Frederick, by this point, was living halfway around the world in Turkey. So he was not as omnipresent as, say, Jack Johnson was in the United States. And Turkey also had changed by this point, because in 1923 the Turkish Republic was proclaimed. It turned against being exceptionally nice to foreigners the way the old Ottoman Empire used to be. And so even within the new Turkish context, there was no interest in celebrating a prominent foreigner. So he fell in between the historical cracks, as it were.
Right.
Although he had been famous during his life. One way in which I can mention is that when American tourists came to Constantinople in the 1920s, they all wanted to do the same thing, what tourists still want to do there now. They want to go see Hagia Sophia. They want to go to the Grand Bazaar. And in those days, they all wanted to go to Frederick Thomas's nightclub to hear some really good jazz and to have a really stiff drink, because prohibition was in force in the States.
I see.
But once he disappeared from the scene, people forgot about him.
So ultimately, what did happen to him?
His end was tragic. He overextended himself after having become successful in Constantinople. He opened ventures that did not succeed. There was too much competition. His creditors seized his properties. He had no protection from the Americans in Turkey, who had washed their hands of him, fundamentally for racial reasons.
Right.
And he was put into debtor's prison, where he contracted pneumonia and where he died. And he was buried in Constantinople. I know the cemetery where he was buried. And then very shortly thereafter, memory of him completely faded.
Well, it's nice that you've brought him back to life.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the project of
And I
digging it up.
understand, you know, you have been offered a couple of different opportunities on the large screen, perhaps, maybe a mini-series and a musical. Let's talk about that.
That's a lot of fun, of course. Several individuals and companies have expressed interest in the possibility of either doing a feature film or, frankly, what is now more appealing is doing a TV miniseries, because that's where a lot of creative energy is going.
Right.
So, you know, many books are called, very few are chosen, so we'll see what happens. But it's promising. What is more certain is a musical version of Frederick Thomas's story, which was solicited from me by an entertainment and hospitality company in New York. And over the summer, I wrote a script for that.
Okay.
There are 9 songs. I worked with the composer at the company to come up with period-appropriate styles of music, early 1920s jazz, Russian gypsy-style music, things like that. And I wrote the lyrics to the music that he composed. We went back and forth. It's going to be a kind of a cabaret-style, one-man show initially that should be staged in New York at some point in late fall or winter. And if that seems successful, the idea is to try to develop it into a full-fledged musical.
Very exciting. Now, it must have been very interesting for you. I mean, I would imagine, have you ever written any lyrics or a script before?
Well, I've written narrative. I hadn't really tried my hand at writing any kind of a play-like form. I did write poetry. I did study poetry a lot and analyzed it a lot in my teaching. So it turned out to be not as much of a stretch to write the lyrics as I also thought it would be when this first came up. And it proved to be a lot of fun.
I bet.
The music was very well composed. The composer was very talented in finding just the right kind of music for what I wanted to do. And it was a very enjoyable process.
Well, we will look forward to that coming out.
Great.
All right. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
For more information about Professor Alexandrov and his research, please visit our website at yale.edu/MacMillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.